My firstborn son, Adam, was born the night that Rain Man won the Academy Award for Best Picture. He was born at Mount Sinai Hospital in Detroit on a day when the Detroit Pistons were on their way to the first of 2 back-to-back NBA championships. Because sports tends to bring out our inner superstitions, during this game, while we watched from our hospital room, our 5-hour-old baby between us, I had to use the restroom more than once, as is common after giving birth. And because sports tends to make us feel very superstitious every time I got up to leave the room, my then husband would say, "No, stay here. They score when you're in the room." It was a lot of pressure. Surely I did not want to be blamed for derailing our homeboys on their way to claiming a victory that would knock the LA Lakers off the pedestal they had climbed by winning 5 NBA championships in 9 years. The NBA championships, known as March Madness, are upon us once again. And for the record, the Detroit Pistons are still in the game. And because I am not above superstitions around sports and not wanting to jinx a game, I will refrain from further comment, for I wouldn't want to assume any blame if my boasting should cause them to fall. Blame. Blame may as well be the main character in today's gospel. The Pharisees blamed Jesus for being a sinner, not of God, because he is healing on the Sabbath. The disciples think either the blind man or his parents are at fault. The Jewish leaders blame the blind man, suggesting he's a con artist who had not, in fact, been born blind. They cross-examine the blind man, asking him repeatedly how his eyes have been opened. And in the end, Jesus tells all those who have casted blame that because they cannot admit they are blind, because they insist we see, their sin remains. Sin. That which keeps them distant from God. In this case, God, who is standing right in front of them. God in the flesh, whom they refuse to see. Blame keeps us blind. It doesn't heal. It doesn't help us see others as whole persons, including their goodness. It prevents us from seeing ourselves as whole people, including our complicity. Blame does not restore, reconcile, or redeem a person or a people. Blame keeps us from seeing that we are each made in the image of God. And right now, blame is more than just a spectator sport. Admittedly, for good reason. The crimes against humanity that are playing out near and far are so repugnant that even with a roof over our heads, with enough food and heat, it is affecting our mental, spiritual, and physical health. This is heightened because we know that we cannot fix it. And so blame becomes a way to cope, a distraction from the work at hand, something to do with our anxiety. If we set aside the blame components of this story, though, this is a story of healing, a story of Jesus' presence and the vision he brings to the blind man, yes, but also to those focused on assigning blame. Jesus is not dissuaded. He restores the sight of a man who has never seen this world or the people in it, at least not with his eyes. He brings this man in from the margins into community, not as someone to pity, but as someone who sees. And the first person he sees is Jesus, his doctor, his Savior. Even without fully comprehending who Jesus is, he sees the God who counters all that he has heard about God. This God contrary to popular opinion, is not judgmental, is not wrathful, is not punishing, is none of these things. This God takes this man back to the very substance from which God created humankind: dust, dirt, spit, mud. And just as in the creation story, God sees what he has created, a man who now can see, and God declares this man good. In fact, in the Genesis story, the lines which are translated, "and God said it is good," can also be translated, "and God said it is beautiful." Jesus is calling the community to remember this sacred truth, that God has created each and all in God's image, good and beautiful. To see this one man's inherent value as connected to their own. In the creation story in Genesis, the original sin wasn't eating the fruit. It was the human response to God's question, "Have you eaten?" They could have said yes, with relief that God is trustworthy and loving, and they won't get in as much trouble if they just tell the truth. They choose not to. They go with attacking and blaming, including perhaps blaming God for their assumption that God is only control and wrath. It was the serpent, it was the woman, technically it was the man. The entrance of sin is when those original humans, instead of celebrating, go on the offensive and choose to avoid trust. The blind man in today's gospel is a better version of Adam and Eve because he is being honest and faithful and willing to relate openly with Jesus and the Pharisees. So today's gospel lays a trap. If we're listening carefully, we dare not point an accusatory finger at the Pharisees or the disciples, or indeed those Christians who believe God needs their help in slaughtering the innocent, those who differ from us. Jesus calls us to let go of blame and recrimination and turn instead to interpreting the world in all its beauty and affliction, in all its blessings and hardship, as a steady stream of opportunities to participate in God's works of love, healing, and reconciliation. The shadows in this passage point to the cross. We're just a couple of short weeks from Good Friday, and the authorities' resentments toward Jesus are gathering like a storm. Nonetheless, Jesus is not concerned about his Good Friday fate. Instead, he is focused on healing. The upshot of today's gospel could well be, do we focus on blame or do we focus on healing? Do we focus on blame or do we focus on healing? As with the blind man, Jesus comes to give us true sight and insight, to make apostles out of ordinary, excluded, disinherited people, and to free us from the ways we blindly blame and scapegoat one another. There is no shortage of hardship in this world right now. We are appalled at the horrors of war. We are distracted by scenes of carnage. We are paralyzed and left mute by the reports of agony imposed by those in power on those who have none. Jesus reminds us to think of hardships in another way, not as results of sins in the past, but rather as occasions for participating in God's works of amazing grace here and now. You see? Participating in God's work is always messy, And sometimes we avoid participating for that very reason. We don't want to get our hands dirty. We have long since lost the desire we had as children to build cities in the mud. To this end, hear the words of Jan Richardson, who explains this well in her benediction, Blessing of Mud. Lest we think the blessing is not in the dirt, lest we think the blessing is not in the earth beneath our feet, lest we think the blessing is not in the dust, like the dust that God scooped up at the beginning and formed with God's two hands and breathed into with God's own breath. Lest we think the blessing is not in the spit, lest we think the blessing is not in the mud. Lest we think the blessing is not in the mire, the grime, the muck. Lest we think God cannot reach deep into the things of earth, cannot bring forth the blessing that shimmers within the sludge, cannot anoint us with a tender and grimy grace. Lest we think God will not use the ground to give us life again, to cleanse us of our unseeing, to open our eyes upon this ordinary and stunning world. Thank you for listening to Take Off Your Shoes. Let me send you out now with this blessing. May God give you the grace never to sell yourself short, grace to risk something big for something good, and grace to remember the world is now too dangerous for anything but the truth and too small for anything but love.